Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes here with Richard Kim, my colleague from TheNation.com, Lynn Vavreck, political science professor at UCLA, George Packer of The New Yorker magazine, and Sophia Nelson from TheGrio.com. We are talking as we have 10 days until the election. There's still some room for some movement in the polls. I think it's fair to say there still remain some people who have not decided. We're talking about that tiny cohort, that small sliver of the electorate who have not decided and what they are going to decide on. And we're talking about when we left, we talked about what effect that has on our politics. And this is something I think about a lot as someone who is quite ideological, is quite committed to a very specific worldview, who thinks a lot about politics, that my vote essentially is taken for granted, and the vote that politicians are catering towards, particularly down the stretch, are these folks. And when they don't seem to have a kind of coherent, fixed conception of what they even want, how does that play itself out in what actual policies we get?
Right. And we were talking about ideology and Romney moving to the middle. And I was just teasing a little bit and saying that I had this result that I thought was going to blow your mind. And so we've been tracking these people over the whole year, and we ask them to place themselves ideologically. And I know I'm talking about the entire electorate, not just undecided voters. And we have them place the candidates. And when we look to see which candidate is closer, so we were talking about the median voter theorem, people think on average that Mitt Romney is closer to them ideologically than they think Barack Obama is.
Fascinating.
So, and the thing that blew my mind about this was that distance is constant since January 1st. So when he was in the primaries, people did not see him as farther away from them on average
hilarious.
than they see him now.
But that just means that none of this matters. That just means that everything that has been, I mean, what you've just said is that one day he's getting up and beating the crap. Can I say that on air? Beating the crap out of Rick Perry for allowing illegals to get in-state tuition at the cost of $100,000 in Texas. And then the next he's talking about how he's going to bring immigration reform. And people just sit there going like, yeah, he basically shares my views.
Wow. Party. We've been talking a lot about party, and it is the lens through which all political information is filtered. And when 95% of the electorate has made up their mind a year ahead of the election, you're going to see a lot of that reducing cognitive dissonance.
Well, one of the struggles that I've had in this election is
you're the only person probably sitting at this table who I don't know.
Undecided leaning, but the deal is that and we were talking about this. I like the president on social issues and things like that. But then Governor Romney's appealing to me on economic and the strength of the national security, kind of the flag waving stuff, right? Not that the president's been bad on, I think he's done a great job. But so when you're someone like me, you're going, well, I like things about both of them, so what do I do? And I've talked to people
and I say you should vote for Romney. Not because I want him to win, but because I think what matters once you're in office is almost always issues like taxes and spending and budget.
Well,
the others are great campaign issues.
Who Romney might nominate for the Supreme Court certainly matters a lot.
It matters, but if you weigh it,
I agree, it's not
if you weigh one Supreme Court appointment against the day in, day out battle on Capitol Hill over
I think the Supreme Court appointment actually wins on that.
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah,
well, because the Supreme Court decides on economic matters too. Also, I mean,
but also there's a duration effect. I mean, the problem. I always think about it this way: Bill Clinton. All right, we all love Bill Clinton now in retrospect, even though at the time a lot of us were very frustrated with him. Everything Bill Clinton did that was awesome, which is basically the performance of the economy, vanished as soon as he was gone. And everything he did that was not awesome, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, which is the Efficient Death Penalty Act, EDPA, which is an immigration bill, which is
Chris,
welfare
you don't
reform.
think
All of that
you
has
don't think
endured.
30 years of inequality has anything to do with how people have governed in Washington?
Oh, I absolutely. I think it's the fundamental thing that drives people.
Then you've just confirmed my point that you should vote for Romney if economic issues, which to me inequality is the fundamental question in this country and has been for a generation.
That I agree with.
What do you like about Romney on economics?
Well,
I'm just curious.
I like that there's a more definitive plan. I like that he's saying he's going to create 12. And again, there are others who would say that's a bogus plan.
There's no plan. Sophia, I'm sorry. There is no plan.
Well, I read the website. There's a plan.
Okay, there's a plan because
you can. The same plan that McCain had, that every Republican nominee has had since 1988. If you ask me
what I like about him, though, I think a lot of people get caught up into this, which is there's the newness of a new guy trying it. But again, I like the old guy, too, so I'm stuck.
But let me tell you this.
But you're going to be
Lynn,
pretty soon.
Yeah, you are. You're edging perilously close to that territory.
This is the challenge, I think, for Republicans in this election and going forward. Women, undecided voters, women make up 60% of the set of undecided voters right now. This week.
That's huge.
And as women have been undecided and making up their minds throughout the year, they are breaking heavily for the president. So
that's been revealed in your data, right?
Why? What's the factor?
Well, I wish I could tell you, but again, because there's just sort of this muted image of a voter, everything matters a little less for them.
You think it's the social issues, like that Romney scares them on the abortion?
The other thing that comes out of our data that you can see very clearly is, in terms of the people who initially support Obama or Romney and flipping to the other side, the most switching is happening for women who initially supported Romney and have now flipped to support Obama.
See, it's the social.
And I think you're right. I think that this is going to be a big challenge if they allow the party identity to become tied to this message.
This gets us to the so-called waitress moms, which is the coinage this time around. Although it's not totally ungrounded. There's some data that suggests that basically women without college educations are and who are working are the group that has the largest sort of demographically richest group of undecided voters at this point. And I was reading some coverage and interviews with folks that are in that demographic who have not made up their mind. And really, it's just a very granular, brutal story about the American economy, right? I mean, these are just folks that are like really in tough shape, and it's super hard to get by, and that's taking up 110% of all the attention and work they have.
Yeah.
And this is something I encountered in 2004 when I was talking to swing voters, which is that there's a fundamental skepticism, and I think this goes to the story about inequality over 30 years. There's a fundamental skepticism that it's going to matter either way. That whoever's in office, like you're working for $9 an hour, 50 days a week, and trying to find daycare for your kid, and that's going to be the case in February, no matter who's elected.
This gets to, if I can put in a plug for the story, for the New Yorker this week. It's a story of a lobbyist who started out as a Biden guy, went into the Clinton White House, and then really made a lot of money lobbying for a bipartisan lobbying firm, Quinn Gillespie, before going back into the Senate to fight for financial reform. His basic life story tells you that the red-blue divide, the war between the colors, in a way matters less in Washington than what I think of as the war of organized money, which is not a sort of war of attrition, evenly matched, a few inches of ground gained a year as the war between the colors is. It's a rout. Every day it's a rout because organized money defeats the public interest on a daily basis on Capitol Hill. And it really doesn't get much attention. It's not talked about much in the campaign. It's not the thing that gets out the undecided voters. So that, to me, is the deeper story behind pretty much every election of our lifetime.
But I disagree with you on the idea that for these waitress moms who in Washington doesn't matter.
I'm not saying that substantively. I'm saying that's their belief that it won't matter.
I mean, okay, so but look at like the Affordable Care Act. I mean, this is something that absolutely matters essentially to working class women who have families that are trying to hold down jobs, and that is what will be eviscerated should Romney win. So,
but now we're getting into a demographics of I'm a high educated voter, right? As are you. So we're sitting around this table, and you said, sir, we're having a very high end intellectual discussion.
I wouldn't go that far.
I think
continue.
And I'm saying that if you think of the waitress mom, she's not watching us. Like you said, she's working and making a living for her kid. But then you've got the suburban moms, the soccer moms, different from the waitress mom. And then you've got the professional woman that's married or single, Gen X. All this stuff matters about how you vote.
But let me say this.
The problem there is that the Health Care Act, for example, which I think is the greatest domestic policy achievement of the Obama administration, most of that hasn't kicked in yet. And I think if it had earlier, we would be looking at a different lean on this demographic.
I was just about to make exactly this case, which is that this is the single greatest achievement of the Obama administration remains not tangible for the majority of people that it will one day benefit. There's concrete benefits up front. There's already things that have kicked in and people keeping their kids on their insurance, etc. But the vast majority of people who will benefit have not benefited from it yet. And a lot of those are folks who I think are on the margins of our political conversation who, if it was different from one day to the next, having health care and not having health care, would know they have a stake in it.
This is the challenge of messaging, I think, in any campaign, but in particular in this campaign. And I think that if we were writing the retrospective on this election, we would call it it's the counterfactual stupid election, because it's, Romney is out there saying things could have been so much better than they are. Think about the counterfactual. And you're saying the Obama campaign should be saying, you're going to be so much better off than you are right now. Just think about, and that's a really tough campaign to run.
And that's because the status quo is mired in this frustrating kind of low-level fever. It's not that the country is, in crisis. We're not Greece. We're not about to pitch over the abyss, and we're also not
depressed.
Right.
I think, and that's why this election has been passionless, and why it's being fought out over little things like what John Sununu said, or what.
Well, that sort of always happens.
Yeah,
There's a lot of cable air.
No, it does, but I think this feels different. It feels like we're in the mud. We're in World War I.
The press is
Lynn Vavreck, professor of political science at UCLA, and George Packer of the New Yorker magazine. Great to have you both here.
Nice to be here.
Thank you.
The Tea Party movement could keep Democrats in control of the Senate again. That's next.
Let's keep in touch.
All right, the basic story of the presidential election for the past month has been Romney's polling gains after the Denver debate that seemed to bring things to a tie, followed by the race settling back into a narrow but consistent lead for the president in the Electoral College. But this back and forth has obscured a very consistent, almost shocking trend in the Senate races. Just 2 months ago, Nate Silver's 538 blog gave Republicans a 61.5% chance of gaining the majority in the Senate. The chance for a Democratic majority sat at 38.5%. Now, 538 puts the likelihood of a Republican Senate majority at a minuscule 13.6%.
That's unbelievable.
That's different than what's on the screen, but more or less, while Democratic chances for a majority are almost at 90%. This turn of fortune for the Democrats could be a result of the attention some of these Senate races have been getting. Missouri Representative Todd Akin, perhaps you've heard of him, ceased being a sure thing in the Democratic race against the Senate race against Democrat Claire McCaskill after his legitimate rape comment in August. Then on Tuesday, during an Indiana Senate debate against Democrat Joe Donnelly, Republican candidate Richard Murdoch said this.
I believe that life begins at conception. The only exception I have to have an abortion is in that case of the life of the mother. I struggled with it myself for a long time, but I came to realize life is that gift from God, and I think even when life begins in that horrible situation of rape, that it is something that God intended to happen.
Wow.
Murdoch and Akin are considered Tea Party candidates, Republicans who came from the party's conservative grassroots. Murdoch won a surprising victory in the primary over six-term Republican incumbent Dick Lugar. These kinds of primary challenges have been a central part, possibly the central part of the Tea Party's political and electoral strategy. For a second election cycle now, though, the Tea Party seems to have caused severe damage to Republicans' hopes of a Senate majority. 2 years ago, Tea Party candidates like Christine O'Donnell, Sharon Engel, and Ken Buck caused Republicans to lose 3 Senate seats. So while the movement has been successful in pushing the party ideologically, it's failed in actually getting a Republican majority in the Senate. The Washington Post's E.J. Dionne argues that even the ideological victories of the Tea Party have been short-lived as the electorate moves back towards the center. Dionne. If conservatism were winning, does anyone doubt that Romney would be running as a conservative? His strategy at the end is to try to sneak into the White House on a chorus of Me Too's. The right is going along because its partisans know Romney has no other option. This, too, is an acknowledgement of defeat, a recognition that the grand ideological experiment heralded by the rise of the Tea Party has gained no traction. Back at the table is Anna Marie Cox from The Guardian, and joining us now is Michael Brendan Doherty, national correspondent for the American Conservative. It is always great to have you here.
Thanks.
I want to play this. So I think this is fascinating because I think the Tea Party dominated all discussions of American politics for a while and then just seemed to kind of disappear from the discussion. And part of that has to do with the fact that they took over the House, and so the Tea Party just became the House caucus. It was channeled into that. Part of that has to do with the fact that what once was a fairly good brand in American politics, which was the Tea Party and the tri-corner hats and the Gadsden flags, has become a terrible brand. It polls very poorly, and you see this reflected in Democratic candidates stopping at nothing to invoke the Tea Party against their candidates. Take a look, their opponents.
Think Tea Party or Richard Murdoch will work with both parties to get things done? Hardly.
Voters are deciding between Linda McMahon and myself, but they are also deciding whether the Tea Party should be in charge of the United States Senate.
The Affordable Care Act comes up over and over again when you're in a state that's being governed by Tea Parties.
He is part of the gridlock. Where is the Farm Bill? Where is the Postal Bill? Where are the bills that the Tea Party is trying to shut down?
You're not going to get it done by somebody who's basically satisfying every single requirement of the Tea Party.
So, Michael Brennan Doherty, has the Tea Party succeeded or failed?
It's not so much the Tea Party. I would just say the conservative movement, of which the Tea Party is kind of a subset, is shrinking and dying. And in a way, I think of electoral majorities and like enduring presidential electoral majorities. The new majority of Nixon that created 2 49 state landslides has been disintegrating for a long time. And it was built on the idea that the left represents a small, radical counterculture that's against you. And increasingly, the Tea Party is representing a countercultural force that's a minority force in our politics. Right. I'm part of that.
Yeah, you're proudly part of the countercultural minority.
Yeah, the moral minority. And that alienates voters. It feels that they're out of the mainstream. And it's very weird that the party that sort of used to represent an unbelievably large coalition in American politics is now controlled by like a very small subset of voters within that coalition. Part of it's because the conservative movement trains its activists and then those people become the candidates, and part of it's just the demographic shifts of America. But I think you've just seen the inversion of the Nixon majority.
I think that decline is way exaggerated. And I think that's exaggerated because if you look at the Senate or the presidential race, it appears certainly that the Tea Party is going to cost them control of the Senate. If you go, the further down ballot you go, particularly if you go to state houses, the Tea Party is absolutely in charge of places like New Hampshire, Wisconsin. And there they have passed a shocking number of laws clamping down on voting rights, on transvaginal ultrasound, and any number of things, and I don't think that is going away. I mean, I haven't looked lately at the sort of state legislatures, but I think that is a force, and they're there to stay.
It might go away in terms of, because I think the Republican Party might start having to police it, because those down ballot races and the state legislatures are starting to give the National Party a bad name.
I'm not sure they can police it.
Except that, like Michael said, they have a much firmer farm team system.
But this is my point, that there's a difference between national politics and state and local, which we know, and we're seeing it play out in the Republican Party, I think, in a very interesting way, because these Senate races where they're talking about rape, these guys look like Neanderthals back from the caveman days, where they're saying, and they're white, they're male, nothing wrong with being white and male, but you're white, you're male, and you're trying to tell women, that rape is an awful thing. But, even the child that's the byproduct of that rape is God's will that child have been born. And it's just, that kind of thing makes people squeamish. Well, and like the professor talked about, Chris, you don't want to identify with the Republican Party like that.
It makes people squeamish because, as you said, Michael, it is a radical minoritarian position.
Well, I mean, listen.
And you believe
Obama's position on abortion, that it should be legal in all circumstances for any reason, is also a minority position.
I agree.
Most Americans are for only the good abortions, something like that. It's only partisans or ideological people like us that have a coherent view. Now, the other thing is, we're talking about the personnel, who's actually running. Where Martha Coakley was a terrible candidate, the Tea Party supported Scott Brown, and he won. Mm-hmm. And there's a way that the Tea Party can be very bloody-minded and practical. They knew Scott Brown was a squish, but they said we've got to get this one more vote in the Senate
to kill
Obamacare, and it didn't work.
Right.
But you have Christine O'Donnell, Richard Murdoch, and Aiken. These are not exactly like your A-team best people.
And I think one of the things I think that's been really interesting about this is the role that abortion has played in all this, partly because I think of a kind of bait and switch that was pulled off during the rise of the Tea Party movement. Yeah. And I want to talk about what that bait and switch was right after this break.
This fall, I'm supporting Richard Murdoch for Senate. As state treasurer, Richard worked with Governor Daniels to balance the budget and make government more accountable. As senator, Richard will be the 51st vote to repeal and replace government-run health care. Richard will help stop the liberal Reid-Pelosi agenda. With so much at stake, I hope you'll join me in supporting Richard Murdoch for U.S. Senate.
I'm Richard Murdoch, and I approve this message.
That's Mitt Romney, who cut an ad for Richard Murdoch, who's been in the news this week after talking about rape and pregnancy resulting from rape as being a product of God's will. And what I think is fascinating about that ad specifically and the way that it relates to the Tea Party is that it's the same bait and switch, which is there was a political strategy that Dick Armey and Karl Rove and a bunch of other strategists pursued during the kind of Tea Party uprising, which was to take a conservative base that was still the same conservative base that everyone was writing about as evangelicals concerned about social issues in 2004. It was those same people, and channel the anger against Barack Obama and make the headline issue the stuff that Mitt Romney talked about in that, the debt, the deficit, Obamacare, etc., and not talk about abortion, not talk about those issues. And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, it turns out these folks still just have super radical ideas on abortion, and now it's blowing up in their faces. So you're seeing exactly the consequence of that, of taking that political tack with the Tea Party, and now it's just sort of coming back to.
But you know what the saddest part about that race is that Richard Murdoch's opponent, Joe Donnelly, also is opposed to abortion, has also voted to defund Planned Parenthood. His stance on abortion is exactly the same as Mitt Romney's, which would outlaw 93% of abortions performed in this country. And there's a bait and switch going on the Democratic Party side, too, which is sending out massive fundraising appeals, DCCC, to raise money around this. And they have not committed, right, to only supporting pro-choice candidates. So I think if you're getting one of those emails, don't give money, give the money to Emily's List.
Yeah, I mean, people have made this point. The DCCC will send out fundraising emails about the war on women, about these issues, and then they'll write big checks to people that are not good on
essentially Mitt Romney on this issue. That is Joe Donnelly.
Right. Well, I was just going to say, we said before, the National Party having some control in more local races or state level races, and this is how they have control. But they can choose, but they won't exert that control as long as people are still winning. I mean, you have to lose really badly. These state level things have to start to go really wrong before the National Party.
This goes back to our earlier discussion about where is politics really and how different are we really. And don't forget, these guys are running in Indiana, right? They are running in their state for United States Senate, but it reflects the culture of the state they're in. It's a very conservative state.
Indiana's
so I'm not surprised that the Democrat also has a similar position as the Republican, and that's where this thing gets murky about state and local to federal.
Well, and Democrats had success in 2006 recruiting candidates that were pro-life or culturally more in tune with their districts.
To get the House majority.
To even Pennsylvania with Casey. So it doesn't cleave necessarily along those lines. I mean, we all say, you were talking about this the first hour, that the election is about the economy, it's about pocketbook jobs, but we do all like talking about the cultural issues. I mean, both sides like talking about what this country is, what it's about, who's it for, what does freedom even mean? Freedom to do what?
But do you
feel none of those, and of course we said this before, but none of those cultural associations are just cultural or social issues. I mean, when you think about what this country is and who it's for, I mean, and who should pay for what, I mean, you start to get into social and cultural.
Right, and also can you control your reproductive health as an economic issue? Can you get married to someone you love and you leave them your inheritance or have hospital visitation rights? I mean, those are all economic issues as well. But what's interesting to me is the idea of we tend to overreact in American political journalism to the latest whatever happened recently. So George W. Bush's fairly narrow victory in 2004, if you look at it historically, particularly for an incumbent, was a sign that the left was dead forever, permanent Republican majority, and then 2006 and 2008 was, oh man, the Republicans are going to be a permanent minority party, and then 2010, I mean, we write these pieces, but the long-term demographic trends are not great for the Republican Party, right?
I mean, people of color, look at, and we talked about this earlier, the Republican Party's greatest challenge, and I've been saying this for 20 years, is that you can't just continue to win with white voters. If Mitt Romney wins this election, he's going to win with white voters. We've seen that polling data. The challenge is, as a governing president, do you want to just win elections with just white voters? Women don't really like you, African Americans, Latinos. That's not a governing coalition, and that's the challenge.
One correction there, which is that the gender gap is nowhere near what the racial gap is, right? In terms of women, I mean, they're not in the same ballpark.
It's huge, though, for the race gap. For blacks,
we are now headed. There's a headline yesterday. If you're looking at the internals of the polls, we're headed towards the most racially polarized election since 1988. And remember, that was the famous election of Willie Horton. That's the direction in which this is headed, and it's a question about whether those political coalitions cleave that way.
Right, and I think just the Democratic coalition is growing. And I mean, you could see like Texas is trending Democratic, and that is an enormous state. And although they have a thing written into their constitution where they can divide into 5 states, I don't think they can gerrymander every Hispanic voter into just one of those 5 states.
But they might just try. That's a good thing.
Remind you that they can. I actually was with the Texas delegation for much of the Democratic convention. My family's from Texas. I knew some people there, and they are insistent though they are the next Colorado.
Yeah, no, and they were talking about my brother worked there for a while. Wisconsin Democratic Senate candidate Tammy Baldwin, who's up in her race in Wisconsin, is going to join us right after this. I want to bring in Wisconsin Democratic Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin, who's running for U.S. Senate against former Republican Governor Tommy Thompson. And Congresswoman, you were behind in this race just a few months ago. Polls are showing you consistently in the lead right now. And I just want to get from your perspective, what has changed up there? What are you hearing from voters? What are you seeing in your numbers?
Well, I would say that right after the Republican primary, Tommy Thompson got a bounce, but just about the time that both partisan conventions had come to a close, people in Wisconsin really began to study this race. And it comes down to the simple question, whose side are you on? And I've been fighting throughout my public service career for hardworking middle-class families. People were beginning to figure out what Tommy Thompson had done with his life since he left Wisconsin to join the Bush administration in 2001 and then became a partner at a large, powerful lobbying firm in Washington, D.C., and realized that he'd really taken the side of big, powerful interests, and he's not for us anymore. And that's really when we saw the polls beginning to change, the momentum beginning to change. And as we come down to the wire, it's a tight race, it's a competitive race, but that's what we're seeing in Wisconsin. People just saying, whose side are these candidates on?
I've been in a few different states that have competitive Senate races and seen some of the television advertising, and it seems to me very nationalized as opposed to very local and specific. It's been a lot about the Ryan budget. It's been a lot about Medicare. I'm wondering if that has been the case in your campaign as well. Have the big budget issues and economic issues particularly dominated, or as we've been talking about today, have things like birth control and marriage equality and things like that been a big part of the conversation as well?
The majority of this campaign has really focused in on jobs and the economy, the difference between our tax plans, the difference between our deficit reduction plans, and certainly a lot about health care and Medicare, especially given the fact that my opponent is a former Bush cabinet secretary, where we have a real record to contrast with regard to health care and Medicare. And in each of those questions, there's also been a local element to it. What have I been doing throughout my public service career? And not so much what Tommy Thompson did as governor, but what has he been doing since he left Wisconsin, joined the Bush administration, and joined a large lobbying firm. And I think that's where people are looking at, there's this old expression, you work hard, play by the rules, and you're supposed to get ahead. And too many families in Wisconsin are just getting by. And they know it's not their work ethic that's changed, it's the rules. There's 2 sets of rules, and whoever can hire the most powerful lobbyists get their way. And in Wisconsin's proud progressive tradition, the people want a voice. And so that's what we're seeing as a sort of local nuance on this otherwise pretty nationally focused race.
It sounds to me like Tommy Thompson's years in Washington. I mean, obviously he was quite a popular governor, and he's obviously won statewide election before. And also at a certain point of time, I remember reading a lot of profiles about Tommy Thompson as a national Republican figure and a kind of vanguard of some new moderate, enlightened vision of Republican social policy. I want to play a little bit of sound. He was caught on tape talking about Medicare. And to me, it says a lot about the kinds of promises that these Republican candidates have had to make to their base and how that comes back to bite them. We're going to take a quick break, and I'll show you that right after this. All right, Congresswoman Baldwin, I want to play this sound for our audience, which is your opponent getting caught on tape talking about his plans for Medicare and Medicaid. Take a listen.
Change Medicare and Medicaid like I did welfare, and who better than me? It's already finished one of the entitlement programs and come up with programs to do away with Medicaid and Medicare. Let's block grant what the state has and allow the states to determine what's going to go into Medicaid. And Medicare, let's wait till everybody that's right now that's under 55 reaches 55 by age 2020, and give them a choice whether or not they want to purchase health insurance with a subsidy from the federal government or stay in Medicare. I'm here to tell you, when you look at the situation, nobody's going to accept it because Medicare is going broke by the year 2022.
That's Tommy Thompson talking to a Tea Party audience saying that whereas he wants to do away with Medicaid and Medicare. What kind of effect has that had in the race?
Well, certainly people were shocked when they saw that video. And Tommy Thompson's trying to do a fast dance around this whole tape. He's claimed that it was taken out of context, even though you played it in its entirety. He has, in last night's debate, he and I had our final debate last night, he said, I never supported a voucher program for Medicare. He has his own new plan. The bottom line is that he supports the elimination of traditional Medicare in much the same way that Paul Ryan has proposed. They offer plans that would shift costs to seniors, and they would be tremendously burdened with out-of-pocket expenses as their vouchers didn't keep up with runaway health care costs. I was raised by my grandparents, and so I had a chance as a young person to understand the value of Medicare. You know, I don't believe it's just a program, it's a promise. And in my campaign, it's a promise that I vow to keep should I become Wisconsin's next U.S. Senator.
Congresswoman, the polls are showing Wisconsin at the national, in the presidential race, closer than I think people had anticipated. John Kerry won Wisconsin in 2004, and so it's, I think, a little surprising to people. It's considered a swing state now. Obviously, Paul Ryan being on the ticket has part of to do with it. But part of that is the economy. Am I right? I mean, it seems that the Wisconsin economy is underperforming nationally. How do you talk to voters about President Obama's record when that's the case?
Well, we all see signs of recovery, but I think across the nation, and certainly in Wisconsin, we're frustrated with the pace. Nevertheless, I think Wisconsinites are clear of how we got in this mess in the first place, and it was decisions made in the Bush administration, supported by my opponent when he was a cabinet member in the Bush administration, and we know it's going to take some time to work out of it. It's why I've focused so strongly on rebuilding Wisconsin's manufacturing economy. You know, between Indiana and Wisconsin, we compete with each other for the number one spot of having the largest manufacturing economy as a percent of our population. And yet we've taken it on the chin in recent years. And so it's why I worked on a bipartisan basis to pass legislation that reins in China's unfair trade practices, whereby they're subsidizing their industry, particular paper. We are the number one producer of paper in the country. So the president and myself have a plan. Frankly, we haven't seen anything from Romney or Thompson on that regard.
U.S. Senate candidate Tammy Baldwin, thanks for joining us this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So what do we know now that we didn't know last week? My answers after this. In just a moment, what we now know that we didn't know last week, but first, a quick update on a story we've been following. We told you about emails we obtained from Arthur Allen, CEO of ASG Software Solutions, pressuring his employees to support Mitt Romney. Since then, several more emails have surfaced from CEOs threatening their employees' jobs if Romney doesn't win. According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, Mike White, the chairman and owner of Right Height, a major manufacturer of industrial equipment in Milwaukee, told his employees in an email this week that they, quote, should understand the personal consequences to them of having our tax rates increase dramatically if President Obama is reelected. White said neither he nor the company wanted to, quote, prejudice any employee for their political views and totally respect your right to vote as you choose. I am simply trying to present the facts as I know them and to protect the business you have helped build. Please think carefully about your vote on November 6th. And as the Huffington Post reported, Jack DeWitt, the head of a Michigan processed food company called Request Foods, slammed President Obama in this month's employee newsletter, writing, quote, the past 4 years with President Obama trying to lead and represent us has been a complete failure. What can we do? What am I going to do? I'm going to vote on number 6 for new hope and change by voting for Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, and Republican Senate candidate Pete Hoekstra. I hope you will join with me. Both of those companies, it should be noted, received federal grants during the Obama administration from programs that were expanded by the American Recovery Act. On his show Monday, Stephen Colbert captured the irony of this kind of CEO blackmail perfectly.
Some of America's top CEOs are assuring a Romney victory by doing the unthinkable, talking to their employees.
This is an email from Arthur Allen, President and CEO of ASG Software Solutions. Subject, will the U.S. presidential election directly impact your future jobs at ASG? I can tell you, if the U.S. reelects President Obama, our chances of staying independent are slim to none. If we fail as a nation to make the right choice on November 6th and we lose our independence as a company, I don't want to hear any complaints regarding the fallout that will most likely come.
Yeah. If these CEOs or their companies have their taxes raised, you employees will lose your jobs, which would be terrible, because then you couldn't work at that great place where your boss threatens you.
We'll, of course, post links to these stories on our Tumblr, upwithchris.tumblr.com, after the show. All right, so what do we know now we didn't know last week? Thanks to a 3-part investigative series from the Washington Post, we know some new facts about the Obama administration's ever-expanding policy of targeted killing. We know the administration is working on converting the list of targets, known informally as the kill list, into a spreadsheet of targets with various possible outcomes from killing to, quote, sealed indictments, and they are calling this new and improved database a, quote, disposition matrix. We know that while the administration institutionalizes targeted killing, it is yet to account on the record for the death of 16-year-old American citizen Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, who was killed by a drone strike in Yemen just 2 weeks after his father, the American Islamist cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, was also killed by a drone strike. We know that according to an unnamed official in the Washington Post story, the 16-year-old son was not the target of the strike that killed him. We know that if you're going to talk about the death of a 16-year-old American boy by our hands, far better to call it an outrageous mistake, as that official did, rather than try to justify it by suggesting that America can kill children for the sins of their fathers, as Obama campaign senior advisor Robert Gibbs did when recently asked about the issue by the group We Are Change.
That's an American citizen that's being targeted without due process of law, without trial, and he's underage, he's a minor.
I would suggest that you should have a far more responsible father if they're truly concerned about the well-being of their children. I don't think becoming an al-Qaeda jihadist terrorist is the best way to go about doing your business.
We know that justifying the death of a 16-year-old boy by reference to his father's alleged sins is the moral logic of collective punishment that has historically been used to justify outright atrocities. We know that it's always possible to misspeak in the moment, particularly on a difficult, sensitive, classified topic, so we fully expect Mr. Gibbs to retract and apologize for what he said. We now know one effect of this exchange about the auto bailout during Monday's debate.
I said these companies need to go through a managed bankruptcy. And in that process, they can get government help and government guarantees, but they need to go through bankruptcy to get rid of excess cost and the debt burden that they'd built up. And fortunately,
Governor Romney,
the
that's
president
not what you said.
Fortunately, the president, you can take a look
Governor
at the op-ed.
Romney, you did not say that you would provide governor help.
You're wrong, Mr. President.
No, I am not wrong. I am not wrong.
People can look it up. You're right.
People will look it up.
Good.
Well, people did look it up. Mitt Romney's now infamous New York Times op-ed titled, "Let Detroit Go Bankrupt," was the most viewed article on the Times website. We know that despite Romney spinning, his position at the time was to let the auto companies go into what is called a free-fall bankruptcy, financed by the private market, rather than the pre-negotiated managed bankruptcy that was funded by credit lines from the U.S. government. We also know that that headline, presumably chosen by a Times op-ed editor, may be the most consequential op-ed headline in history. And finally, we don't know the name of the man pictured at this voting location in Chicago on Thursday, but we do know that he had the most surreal voting experience of anyone in the country, since he happened to be next to this other guy who was casting his own vote. Oh, don't mind me, no pressure. Vote for whoever you want. I want to find out now who my guests know they didn't know at the beginning of the week. Richard Kim?
So right after this show, I'm going to a Nation magazine wedding, and it's a same-sex one. Our former director of digital, Kelly, is marrying her partner, Anja, who was my former intern at the Nation. So I totally want to congratulate them, first of all. I want to congratulate my friends Brian Cates and Jonathan Cohen, who also recently got married. We know Mitt Romney would support a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage, but now we know, thanks to BuzzFeed, reporting from BuzzFeed, that he also thinks hospital visitation rights should not be allowed to gay couples. Dave Buchanan, his advisor, has said that he would repeal an executive order that Obama passed in 2010 that would allow hospital visitation rights for gays.
That's a great thing to know. Anna Marie Cox.
I'm just going to say that this week we marked the 10th anniversary of Paul Wellstone's death in Minnesota, where I live now, my adopted home state. And the great tradition of upper Midwest progressivism is alive and well in Minnesota. Obama's going to win, and Minnesota might actually be one of the first states to fully reject a gay marriage amendment, which is be very exciting.
The Paul Wellstone death was really just so devastating when it happened, and he just remains a testament to conviction politics and to organizing, and everything that I think is great about politics and can be great about politics was represented by Paul Wellstone. Michael Brennan Doherty.
So I didn't know about an incident that happened in 1995 where Norwegian scientists wanted to study the aurora borealis, and they warned the Kremlin that they were going to launch a rocket into space to do this. But still, the radar signature of the rocket looked like a U.S. Trident missile sent in the direction of Russia as an EMP. Boris Yeltsin was awakened in the middle of the night, and he actually opened up the nuclear football and began discussing whether to launch hundreds of ICBMs at the United States.
Oh my God!
So I'd like to bring this up to bring up a very retro issue, which is actually the abolition of nuclear weapons, which is something that Ronald Reagan even proposed to his interlocutors.
And that President Obama is in support of the abolition of nuclear weapons. He's on the record with that. Negotiated the START Treaty. Sophia Nelson.
This week for me was the Murdoch issue of the rape and the fact that you could say it was something God intended, the pregnancy as a result, not the rape. And that really was an eye-opener for me, which caused me to go back into my undecided vortex of, what am I going to do in this election? So
well, you'll have to let us know how that turns out. My thanks to Richard Kim from TheNation.com, Anna Marie Cox from The Guardian, Michael Brennan Doherty from The American Conservative, and Sophia Nelson from TheGrio.com. Thanks for getting up. Thank you for joining us today for Up. Join us tomorrow, Sunday morning at 8. We'll have Jane Mayer from The New Yorker on her new report about a notorious figure from Bush-era voter suppression. Turns out he's back. And coming up next is Melissa Harris-Perry on today's MHP. With the campaigns on pace to pass the $2 billion mark, Melissa asks, are our votes for sale? Plus, good news in This Week in Voter Suppression. There is a plan to fight back. Find out what it is on Melissa Harris-Perry next. We'll see you right here tomorrow at 8. Thanks for getting up.